Hey everyone, this is Car Ray Rob.
Ray.
I'm Rob, and we want to welcome you to our podcast, Say Hello to My Little Film.
Hey there, it'll be just a little while till Ray and Rob spit their spittle. Come on, check out of the hospital. So grab some of your best peanut brittle. This will be a darn good transmittal. And say hello to my little film.
Man, it really does not feel like we have already reached episode 6.
I know we're like old hats at this now.
Seriously, I mean, how old do you think this podcast is in dog years?
Well, 6.
Oh, is that how that works?
That's how I do that.
Fair enough. Well, welcome everyone to our 6-year-old.
I hope you've listened to all 6 episodes.
Thank you. Oh, if you have, thank you. But as we said, this is episode 6 of Say Hello to My Little Film, where we bring fresh perspectives to retrospective reviews. And this week, it's Ray's episode. So, what do you got?
What do you got? What do you got? What do you got?
All right, Rob. What I got for you is it's a movie I love, which is that's the rules.
Well, it's a good rule and a rule to follow.
It's a rule. It's a movie you haven't seen. That checks rule number 2.
Man, we are moving right along here.
And this movie that I'm presenting to you, my little film that I'm presenting to you,
Aha.
is Brian and Charles.
Oh, I vaguely remember.
So
Is this a movie about a man with a robot
this is a
or
movie.
a cardboard box?
Yeah, they're one and the same.
Oh, okay.
Yes. This is a movie about a lonely man
Okay.
who, during one harsh winter, creates a robot,
Okay.
befriends said robot,
Okay.
and then the movie just takes off from there. This is one of the things I like about this movie that I think is interesting is I love this movie.
Mhm.
It's not an Academy Award winning movie. It was nominated for some BAFTAs and stuff. It's
Oh,
good.
Okay. I
good,
wasn't aware of that.
but it's and I think that's kind of what's interesting about our podcast is what we love isn't always doesn't mean it has to be a classic.
Oh, it's true.
Doesn't mean it has to be good.
Well, I mean, we think it's good.
Yeah, to me it is. Doesn't mean
Yeah.
it will be to you or to everybody else who's listening, but
Fair
it's
enough.
what we love,
Right.
right? And so
Exactly.
this movie stars David Earl and Chris Hayward. They are also the writers of the movie. Now, David Earl is, if you have watched any Ricky Gervais TV shows, you'll recognize him.
Mhm.
He's in all of his stuff, and
Like his version of The Office or.
Okay, maybe he's not in that. He's in.
He's not in that.
He might not be. He's in a lot of the other stuff. I've never watched. Yeah, I don't think he's in The Office,
Okay.
and I don't know if he's in Extras either. I've never watched Extras.
So he's not in any of his shows. Is what
He's
you're
been
trying
in
to
2
say.
shows that I've seen, Ricky Gervais's, and that's all that matters.
You promised me he was in every episode. I distinctly heard that 10 seconds
Play it
ago. You
back.
said you promised me every show.
Okay, he's in a lot of things with Ricky Gervais, and he
That's
plays kind of the
A
same
lot's
guy.
doing A lot of heavy
Yeah.
lifting here.
He plays kind of the same guy.
Okay.
Very brash, but now this is a PG movie, so I think David is kind of forced to hone the character in a lot, and I think it works. I think to the benefit. This will be a movie I think within the first 5 minutes, and this is probably the thing I love most about the movie is within the first 5 minutes you are, I think, in love with Brian to the point where you're like, I'm ready to watch this dude for a half hour.
Okay.
And so that's my challenge to you is don't fall in love with him in the first 5 minutes.
And run away with Brian.
Yeah,
I
and
will.
then just go on for the ride. It's fun. It deals with some topics that
Mhm.
similar to some stuff we've addressed before. So it'd be cool to see some callbacks, but it does it in a unique way with a robot.
So this is a British movie.
This is a British
so
movie.
It's like kind of the Ricky Gervais universe
Yeah.
that he's fully a part of.
Right.
Clearly.
Clearly. Very clearly.
Very clearly.
Yes,
Okay, well that's
very
cool.
British. And so, it's funny because the first movie I did in the podcast for episode 2 was
Mhm.
a mockumentary.
Right.
It's very quite possible the next movie I do on episode 8 will be a mockumentary. And this movie isn't quite a mockumentary. It's filmed like a regular movie
Uh-huh.
95% of it, but he does talk to people behind the camera who you never see. So I guess he is being documented. There's no explanation on like why he's being documented or like what their plans are to do with this documentary. But
Huh.
but it's weird because he does talk to people behind the camera, but
Right.
it's other than that, like it's not a mockumentary other than that.
That's interesting. Yeah, I think I remember watching the trailer, and I think I was vaguely intrigued. You know, I think maybe for me the one thing that maybe kind of stood in my way from ever checking this movie out was just I didn't know if it was a movie that would overcome like the gimmick, you know.
Yeah.
And so I'm curious to see if, you know, again, vague, so I don't remember exactly the trailer.
Yeah.
But I like I said, I remembered the robot. I
Right.
remembered that in the cardboard box looking.
It's a washing machine.
Oh, is
Yeah,
it?
his body is a washing machine.
Oh, it's a washing machine. Okay, fair enough. A box. I knew it was a
Yeah.
box of some kind.
Yes.
Okay, so cool. Yeah, no, I'm
It is,
excited to check it
yeah.
out.
It's a good. It's you're right though. You know, it's like we've seen guys make robots before. Now what happens next? And you
Yeah.
know, is it different enough? But like I said, this is just something where you just root for the character so hard. You know, I mentioned he's lonely. You want to see that, you know, that bridge gapped for him, and it's lovely, and thus I love it.
Okay, well, fair enough. Well, Ray has officially sold me on it. I will not refuse his request to watch this film, so I think we are going to do that right now. So we invite all of you to pause the podcast if you have not seen Brian and Charles and check it out, and then come back and see if I agree with Ray that this is a movie to love.
Ray and Rob are currently watching the film. You may be also watching the film. If you're not, then you're listening to me say that Ray and Rob are watching the film. They'll be right back when they're done watching the film.
All right, folks, we are back. Rob has watched Brian and Charles. I have watched it again. Rob, I kind of set it up. I hope I didn't oversell, but I kind of said the first 5 minutes you were going to fall in love with this character. Did it work?
I would say that in the first 5 minutes, I definitely felt a strong attraction,
Yeah.
love to Brian.
Yeah.
Brian.
Yeah. It's hard to not just be like, want to support him.
Yeah,
You know?
absolutely. He's a very lovable character. I mean, he has a lovable appearance. Like, even though he's a bit of a
Yeah.
you know,
Like you feel
he's
you're
a bit of a
handsomer than he
schlub.
is kind of guy.
Sure, but yeah, he's kind of got that schlubby appearance. But even beyond that, his attitude is magnetic in
Yeah.
a way that I think is really great.
Yeah, he's a lead who you want to just like root for, right?
Yeah.
You want to root for his success. You're like, all right, I've known you for 5 minutes, but I want you to win at whatever this movie is going to throw at you.
Right. Yeah, he's very optimistic, even
Yeah.
when his inventions seem to fail, and how
Yeah.
many of them are really successful. It's it's hard to tell.
Yeah, maybe
Some
his
of them are
trash can where he puts his cabbages in is successful, but
just, right, or his trawling, trawlers for feet, like his shoes.
Oh, yeah,
the
the shoe
shoe
trawlers.
shoe
Yeah.
trawlers. That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Shoe trawlers. That's what he called them. Yeah, and like so, it's like I'm sure they work, but do you want that to
Right.
work? Like,
right, his pine cone bag works.
His pine. It's very fashionable.
Yeah.
It's very
So,
fashionable.
Every time I watch this movie, I rewatch the first 10 seconds like 10 times just because it's just like it's like beautiful to me. Like it's just this moment where basically the screen is pitch black and you just come into the movie with this voiceover that says, I was very low. And then you just see this guy working on an invention, hammering along, and you're like, oh, what? Why are you low? Like, what's
Right.
going on? And he turns into his cheerful personality, which you see a lot of in just the introductions to him at first, where it's like he knows things don't always happen great. He said his life has gone topsy turvy, but quickly he can see the other side of it.
Yeah.
And he even has a cool moment where he's like, his philosophy on life is when one door closes, another door opens, and when that door closes, another one opens that. But even in that line, I think
Doors open and close, no
Yeah.
getting away from it.
Right. And I even think, but he says it so long that eventually, he said it so many times
Yeah.
that eventually he's like, I hope another one open. So you start to see that aspect of him too. It's like he's got this personality that like I always think something good is going to happen, but I also in the back of his mind he's worries that it won't.
Yeah.
I just think they have a lot of those moments where it's like it's something quaint and pretty and beautiful, but there's that hint of like loneliness and worry in it that we all feel. So I just like he's just so relatable to me.
Yeah, there's a kind of like a rugged individualism to him, like
Yeah.
where it's like he seems on the surface to be very confident about who he is, but you can tell that there is a need for companionship, which is obviously what leads
Yeah.
to the the overall story
Yeah.
of this movie of him creating Charles. But it's interesting to me because with being as likable of a character as he is and being as clearly detached from the world around him as he is, there is really one question that really kind of sticks out in my mind, that I kept asking myself the entire time I'm watching the movie. And that
Which
is,
was
who is filming this movie?
yeah, as I kind of said in
Right.
our section before this, like it's kind of a mockumentary. Sometimes you forget that it's being filmed like a mockumentary.
But is it? Because like you said, there are those moments when clearly there's. I wasn't sure how many moments he would be kind of talking to the crew or breaking the fourth wall, whatever.
Yeah.
Out from your description, but it was way. I will say it was way more than what I anticipated.
Yeah.
And especially from like watching the trailer and stuff. But I have a theory. I have a kind of an out there theory, and I think it kind of encapsulates a lot of my thoughts about this movie and about Brian and Charles as characters and like what this movie is ultimately trying to say.
Well, let's hear it.
So, as far as I don't think anybody is filming this movie. I don't really think this is supposed to be a mockumentary. I think Brian is filming this movie in his mind. I think he sees himself as an inventor. Maybe even somewhat of a famous inventor in his mind that somebody might make a movie about. If this were a situation where he had already made Charles, and then it was like, oh, well, now a mockumentary is coming to, or a documentary, quote unquote, crew is coming to film him because he made this robot, I'd be like, okay. But he's essentially a nobody in the beginning of this movie.
Yeah.
And there's a documentary crew series following him. I don't think they're there. And so I think this is kind of him in his mind, whether it be somewhat delusional or just, maybe that's too harsh of a word, but it's just this kind of self-aggrandizement.
Yeah.
And this need to be seen as a specific way. And that is why he is having this documentary made about him. And
Rob did air quotes there, just so you know.
Oh, thank you. That's true. Nobody can see that.
Right.
But so yeah, exactly. So it's like, I wrote down a couple things like, is the crew real? Which again, I just kind of went into. So there are moments like, the scene where the meter reader comes in.
Right.
Like, I think there were a couple scenes, instances where maybe somebody looked. I'm not sure if I didn't notice if the meter reader did. I don't think he did. I remember there was a scene with Eddie, the antagonist, at one point where he kind of looks. But in most of these movies, it's almost kind of a staple cliche of a mockumentary movie is when, a character enters a situation that it's like outside of, his normal space. Somebody notices the crew and it's like,
Sure.
well, what's all this? Like,
they address it.
Right. And somebody, acknowledges that there are people in this room that are not supposed to be here. You know what I mean? Even if whatever this situation that's happening between the main character and this other person is, there's these other people that are there filming it for some inexplicable reason.
Their natural reaction would be to, why is there a camera here now?
And especially with somebody like the meter reader, like you would think that would happen in that scene, but it didn't. And
I can't remember if he looked at the camera or not.
I can't. I don't think he did. I think there was one instance when Eddie did, but like
I can't remember if Hazel necessarily does.
Right, but so it really kind of leads me to this idea that, like I said, it's a need to be seen and a need to be seen a specific way. And like I said, I think it's so layered throughout the movie, like his fear
Yeah.
of the outside world, which again we'll kind of get to in relationship to Charles
Yeah.
eventually. But even when it comes to the people in his town that he does have interactions with, it's not like he's a hermit that never
Right.
leaves his house. Like he does interact with people, but I think he's just so kind of afraid that in the outside world that there's this awkwardness to him.
Oh, definitely, definitely. There's an awkwardness. Do you think, with just like thinking of it as a, from as a filmmaker's tool to just choose, to choose the format of mockumentary. One thing I always kind of think about this movie, because I do feel like something like, like I said in my, what I kind of think of in the before section is, it's like the movie forgets it's a mockumentary sometimes, and it's, in the way it's filmed and such. And maybe that's kind of what to your point, like that, that people aren't always acknowledging the camera, that really only Charles and, Charles does, definitely does, Charles and Brian. But do you think it helps the movie, like that format, or do you think it could have been shot like like a normal movie?
No, I think it absolutely helps it. I
Yeah.
think it kind of like, in those types of movies, we've done we did What We Do in the Shadows.
Yeah.
Is that the other
Yeah.
documentary?
So
Yeah,
far,
documentary.
my next
So-
movie might be another one, but
Oh,
yes.
okay, fair enough.
That's what I said before.
My God, man, what
I
are you
know.
doing? But yeah, it's so yeah. I mean, in a lot of these movies, I do think that, as we've said with like What We Do in the Shadows, it's interesting because they are can be used to kind of bring a realism to something that's not necessarily real.
Right.
Vampires in that instance, and in this one, it's so somewhat the same because it's this guy making a robot. Not that that's that unrealistic.
Right.
It's pretty common in our world now.
But
Where people
functional
make
AI.
Functional AI, exactly.
Yeah.
That's a bit different, but.
And I think in this movie especially, you get that, it's like a cheat code for exposition when you can
Mhm.
have the guy look at the camera and tell you exactly what he's thinking. You don't need another character to come in and pose the question, or have to put in, a scene that has every scenario that you want to get out of his brain, because he's just going to look at the camera and tell you what he's thinking.
Absolutely.
And so, it helps you get attached to Brian, who's
Mhm.
Brian, who's a character you have to get attached to quickly, I think in the movie. And so, it's a useful tool in that way.
Well,
for
especially
sure.
a loner character.
Yeah.
Like Brian, because you're right.
There's
like,
nobody
he's-
else for him to talk to.
Exactly, and even in a situation where it's like with Hazel, or the shopkeeper, or whatever, like his openness isn't there. Again,
Yeah.
he's awkward. Like he'll say these things, and he'll seem like on the surface like a pleasant person, because he is. He's not an unpleasant person by any means, but he still doesn't open himself up to those human relationships until he eventually does that with Hazel, which again we'll get to. I'm sure
Yeah.
once we broach Charles as a
Right.
character.
Well, maybe we should broach Charles. I think the movie kind of turns into something very interesting, I think, when Charles comes around. And we kind of mentioned that that Brian is an inventor, and I don't think we mentioned, but at the beginning of the movie, he invents the cuckoo clock.
Right.
And the cuckoo clock is put together inside a shopping cart that's attached to a bicycle
Right.
that he's going to fly above the city. When I just love about, I just think this character, he talks to the camera. He says, I'm going to get to the end of the corner. I'll be going about 90 miles per hour. Then I'll take off and start flying. I'm like, well, that's optimism.
Right.
You're going to get this bike to 90 miles per hour.
Or you're going to go
But,
faster than a DeLorean.
Yeah. Which, well, that doesn't work.
Right.
And then I think you mentioned the quote where he says, he does, or he mentioned the idea that he doesn't get upset when his inventions don't necessarily work. He's just going to keep making another one.
On to the next one.
And then he makes Brian.
Right.
And, right away, Brian doesn't work. He flips Brian on a couple times. He doesn't
Mhm.
work. And then you see a moment in Charles doesn't work.
Mhm.
You see a moment from Brian where you do see some disappointment, and you feel for him, because you're like, it's not just a normal invention. When he started to make this robot, you could tell he was making a companion,
Mhm.
which is addressing this loneliness that that we have noticed as a viewer of this film.
Yeah.
And I think they give you those glimpses of that disappointment in Brian, and keep him kind of rounded character. And I think it's brilliant when they do that kind of those little things.
Absolutely. I think Charles the creation of Charles is interesting to me because he refers to him as a robot, but there's actually a couple things about his creation that make me feel like Brian didn't want wanted him to be a real person.
Yeah.
And it's interesting little thing. So like there's that part when he doesn't work and he's going through it and it's like, oh, his spleen is working.
Right.
And he pulls out the glowing ball. It's like his spleen. Well, robots don't
Oh,
have spleens.
spleen is working. Yeah.
So why? Well,
Yeah.
so the fact that he sees this robot having a spleen is an interesting kind of tell. Even before that,
Most
when
robots don't eat cabbage though either, and Charles eats a bunch of cabbage.
there you go. He loves cabbage. He even draws it in his pictures, which
Yeah.
is great. But yeah, I mean, the beginnings of it, where he's kind of like digging through the trash, and he finds the head that ultimately becomes Charles,
Mm-hmm.
and then he's picking out pieces, and there's one point where he picks out a little like metal disc looking thing, and he calls it a belly button.
Yeah.
Like, look, belly button, and it's like, and like it's that kind of interesting idea of like a live birth. You know what I
Right.
mean? Like, why would a robot have a belly button? Like,
Right.
it's not a live birth. So it's those little things that in my mind, like I think Brian ultimately like wanted him to be human. It's
Yeah.
like it's like kind of like the Pinocchio thing. Like he's
Yeah,
gonna be a real
definitely.
boy, you know?
Yeah, because he didn't want a robot to help pluck cabbages around the house. He wanted somebody to be a friend. You know
Right.
what he wanted? He wanted somebody to play darts with. And
Exactly.
that's what he was creating. That's why it's kind of heartbreaking at first when Charles doesn't work.
Mm.
But there is a point. Once he gets going, Charles starts to learn how to communicate rather quickly. He reads the
Mhm.
dictionary overnight, and their relationship starts to evolve.
Yeah.
And it's funny how they use Charles because he kind of goes through like cycles of life in a way, or
Right.
childhood.
Absolutely.
But kind of before we get into that, they become friends, and I think to the point that we were just making, there's a scene in the movie where Charles says to Brian, "You are my friend,"
Mhm.
and I think when you look at Brian in that moment, and congrats to David Earl, the actor, for holding the moment, but it's just like it looks like that hasn't been said to Brian in a long time,
Yeah.
and you just again as a viewer, you're connected to this friendship for
Yeah.
the rest of the movie.
Absolutely. I think, they had there was a great chemistry between them.
Yeah.
For being a robot, quote unquote
Mhm.
robot, and a person. I think it was genuine from the start,
Mm-hmm.
which I think even like when in that scene when he names him, when he lets Charles pick his name.
Charles Petrescu.
I'm gonna laugh every time I hear it. I'm gonna laugh every time I hear it. But it's I think it's a testament to the actor David Earl and to the actor who plays Charles, which
His name is Chris Hayward.
perfect. So I think they did a lot of legwork in that regard right
Yeah.
off the bat. And one thing that I think is very interesting about Brian and Charles kind of going forward is this idea of knowledge versus experience.
Yeah.
And I think it kind of that divergence or I should say that those two things kind of happen right up front because like you said, Charles reads the dictionary in a night.
Right.
So knowledge is very easy for him, and it's easily obtained and retained, and he can stockpile that knowledge, at a rapid pace. Experience is different.
Sure.
It's a completely different thing, and I think that's one way that their relationship is similar and diverges as the movie goes forward.
Yeah, I think so. I kind of see, I think when you see the beginnings of this movie, you're going to see some kind of buddy movie. I think a lot of, even this, maybe the use of robots a lot is like a buddy cop type, movie thing. But this movie really is a little bit different because it's really more like a parent kid movie.
Absolutely.
And Charles is the kid, and so like you
Mhm.
said, and we've kind of talked about some of these ideas in a couple of our of these early podcasts we've done, where like it's parents' unwillingness to let go,
Mhm.
and their parents' unwillingness to see what their kids have become,
Yeah.
that affect a lot of the relationships, and that quickly happens with Charles and Brian because Charles grows up kind of like he starts off the movie as kind of a kid. You see him kind of going to some teenage angst years
Right.
as and then eventually maybe the college years where you want to come home and go off on your own. But you're right, because then it's the knowledge where they're very similar, like you just mentioned, and then the experiences are kind of where Brian is more of the parent, because he's had experiences, we assume, and he kind of hides from getting exposed to too many more.
Right.
Where in my opinion, Charles, since he knows he doesn't have any experiences, he wants to experience the world, and then some ways Brian holds him back from doing that.
Absolutely.
Or tries to.
And going into when we've talked about this in previous movies, it's the same here. It all stems from fear.
Right.
I mean, there's even a moment when the doorbell, we mentioned the meter reader earlier, like the doorbell, Brian's reaction to the doorbell is just, that the dread that comes over him in that moment, because somebody's going to be entering their world,
right,
and could see Charles, or
yeah.
I actually go back, to be fair, I'm gonna say this. I do actually wonder if, I wrote down on my notes, like, why is Brian afraid to show off Charles? And I think on the surface you might be able to say, oh well, part of it is because of like Eddie, the bully,
right,
which I'm sure we'll get to in a minute. But I am actually of the idea that, now that I'm sitting here thinking about it, that it's not so much that Brian is afraid to show off Charles. Brian's afraid to show the world to Charles.
Yeah, I agree with that. There's a I didn't mean if I cut you off there.
Go for it.
But there's a there's a scene, kind of like what you're saying, like the cottage that Brian lives at is his world, and like as you mentioned, when the meter guy comes into it, it's people coming into his world, which is scary to him. But early in the movie, you hear like there's a Charles kind of in a poignant, like childish, very simple way says, does it all stop at the tree? And he's looking at the tree that's outside the fence.
Right.
And he's basically asking, does the world stop at that tree? And Brian's like, well, no, it goes on, it goes on heaps. And then Charles immediately wants to then go to that. He wants to leave this safe space, this world that Brian's created, like almost immediately. He wants to experience.
Yeah.
And Brian is like, nope, you're not allowed to do that. You can't leave this. And I think it's to your point. I don't think he wants to share him or risk losing him, to the outside world, to everybody else.
Yeah, and it's funny too, because we've talked a lot about parent-child relationships, but I think in certain regards, Brian himself is a bit stunted in that regard. I mean, and that's why in the end, the bully character isn't Charles's bully, it's Brian's.
Right.
So I think, and again, that's something you see of more in a child character, kid teen character than you do in an adult character. Not that you don't see them. Obviously, adults have bullies too, but there is just a childlike wonderment to Brian.
Yeah.
That I think it's interesting that they kind of start out on that same footing, and then, like I said earlier, kind of diverge into two different worldviews. Now, granted, Brian grows. I don't want anybody to think that like while Charles is like wanting to go to the edges of the earth to explore. It's
Honolulu.
He
wants to go to Honolulu. He gets addicted to the idea of going to Hawaii.
But Brian does have his own growth, and that it comes in the form of Hazel.
Right. Yes. She kind of pops up here and there throughout the movie. There's chemistry between the two. They both are kind of living in certain circumstances where Hazel's kind of trapped into the mundane life that she's living, with her taking care of her mother, or whatever that situation exactly is. They don't go into much. And it's because of Charles that Brian is exposed to Hazel, and that opens the door for Brian's growth of letting somebody in and starting to experience that, letting things in isn't the worst thing, or experiencing things again isn't the worst thing. And that's where he starts to find, I think, the ideas of what he'll do with Charles.
One of the interesting things that I kind of like about the Hazel, Charles, Brian kind of triangle is like Charles kind of pushes them together. Where it's like, oh, you should invite her to come to the lake. Right. And it's,
you guys do your thing, I'll do my thing.
Right. So it's like, it's hard to tell, like, if Charles wants her to come because he's trying to matchmake, and then gets kind of buyer's remorse in that because, like, oh, Brian is, ignoring him because he does
Mhm.
he can get annoyed when Brian starts like, what are you doing? Like, why are you doing like you do whatever and
Yeah.
don't step your toes in the water, whatever. But you're right. It also could be like this idea of like, oh, I need a distraction.
Yeah. Yeah.
I need to find you somebody so I can leave.
Yeah.
Like that kind of
Well, yeah,
thing.
because even another scene, or I think the ending of that like lake scene, where he's trying to dip his toes in the water. Charles gets a little mouthy toward Brian in front of Hazel, and Brian says, I don't like hanging around with you as much anymore.
Yeah.
And then Charles responds with, "Well, then let me go."
Right.
Like, and to me that just seems like it's just such that parent kid aspect. If like you're the one bottling me up. If you don't like me bottled up, then let me go. I just
Right.
love how they toy with those themes. Because Charles is going through, like I said, mentioned earlier, that teenage angst. He's listening to rock music.
Right.
He's
closing himself
yeah.
up in his bedroom and
Yeah.
angry.
He becomes very cheeky.
Yeah.
He wants to leave all the time, and it's tough.
Yeah.
It's
Little comment.
yeah, lots of little comments. It's lots of little comments that Brian likes less and less.
Yeah.
But then, it kind of culminates with, you mentioned the bully character, Eddie.
Yeah.
Who, is in a couple scenes is proven to be a thorn in Brian's side.
Yeah.
But
really the whole town.
Yes, the whole town, not just Brian. He's not Brian's bully. He really is the town's bully. But he ends up kidnapping Charles, and
Right.
like in any great movie where the family is starting to be split apart, there has to be that thing that pulls them back together.
Yeah.
And for me, when you see Charles with like chains on him, he's being used like an ox.
Right.
It pulls it back together.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, when he walks up and like Charles is like, "I want to go home,"
Yes.
and you're just like, "Oh God." Ugh.
I know.
Yeah.
Oh,
it was a bit heart wrenching in that moment. But it's interesting because with a bully character like that, it really was, as I said earlier, the whole town that was kind of allowing this guy to act the way that he did. To be perfectly honest, I mean, and you watch that and you're kind of like, why don't you just go to the cops? You know what I mean? Like, why wouldn't you just go to the police?
Yeah.
But the whole town is kind of co-signed on to just letting this guy do these kind of things, which is an interesting kind of aspect, I guess, of this story.
Yeah, I think that is a kind of a this theme that like people are more than just what they seem, or they're, and almost kind of meaning the opposite way what you think when you say like people are more than they seem, because it's like when you see like when Hazel meets Charles for the first time, she says, "What are you?" and he says, "I'm Charles Petrescu." And like he sees himself as a man, as a person,
right? Where
she was asking like, "What are you? You're a robot." And I think Brian sees himself as a loner and not really able to get into a relationship at first, and then that's incorrect. And I think the town sees Eddie as this being that they can't do anything about, and quickly realize, yeah, we can. So I think this misrepresentation of what your eyes see and what is really there, that because of fear in a lot of situations, it's something they kind of toy with in those circumstances.
Definitely. And it's interesting to have a character arc not just be for a person but a whole town.
Yeah.
Because it does kind of happen that way in the end kind of, when the final confrontation takes place.
Yeah, it's kind of like that whole Spider-Man, like the early Spider-Man movies. You got to fight the whole town if you're gonna. But so it's like kind of like that, but it's mostly. I mean, Brian does most of the legwork.
Right. That's fair. Yeah, and it's great too because I think. In a lot of instances, you see this in a lot of other bully movies, whether it be like The Karate Kid or name a bunch of different ones. But like this idea of like in the end when you fight back your bully, like you punch him in the face, or whatever. And like I appreciated how Brian was able to not sink to Eddie's level where it was like physical violence per se, but he used his inventions.
He got some inventions to work.
Right, exactly. The cabbage gun and then what was the ultimate
super shover
or something like that, which was just, it was so great. And I mean, it really worked, man. It knocked Eddie right back into the truck. It was great.
Sure did. And Hazel inspired him to fight for Charles, which I think was good too. So, and then as this movie should, it ends with Brian letting Charles go. He buys Charles a ticket around the world, which whatever that means. I would like to get one of those.
Just around the world.
Yeah. It's definitely stopping at Honolulu first. But he gets to the point. He got Charles back from Eddie, and he was then ready to embrace his life with Hazel. He's not going to be alone, and he understands that Charles needs to do his thing.
Yeah.
And it's just it's on the nose, but it works. It's what needed to happen, and it's fun.
Will Charles ever come home? Will Brian ever see Charles
He
again?
sends postcards.
Yeah.
We do see that.
Yeah, but does he ever come home?
That's
does he ever,
the sequel.
Right, exactly. I want to know. Brian and Charles 2, Charles comes home.
Yeah, exactly. And what is that like?
I don't know. He's very bored at home. He's like, man, or maybe it's quite the opposite. Like, I've seen everything now. This is great. I love this chair. Yeah. I just want to sit in this chair.
That's how I feel. I mean, good Lord, I just want to sit in a comfortable chair most days. All right, Rob. So, I shoved this movie on you. Not sure if you had high expectations, but let us know what you thought about it, and if you would recommend this to people going forward.
I will say, watching the trailer, I had a few trepidations because movies like this that have that kind of, hook that is, and especially when it's around an art direction piece, like a set piece, so like a quirky robot, or
robot with a washing machine for a body,
right? Or things like that, or something like Brigsby Bear. I remember we watched that movie a long time ago, like Brigsby Bear, or Gentleman Broncos. These kind of like indie twee type movies that they really rely so hard on aesthetics, the quirky aesthetics, that you kind of can lose the story.
Yeah.
I think somebody who does it really well is Miranda July, who has directed Me and You and Everyone We Know, The Future, and I think this movie kind of taps into the same humanity that she does.
Mm-hmm.
I think in Brian and Charles, they were able to kind of bridge that or not bridge, but they like get over the hump of that, like be more than just this like quirky set piece and or this quirky character, this like quirky hook, and they actually told a really great story about a guy who really needed to get out of his own shell, and instead of having a manic pixie princess, he creates a big boxy robot, that kind of pushes him to be the person that he needs to be. So in the end, yes, I did very much enjoy Brian and Charles. It kind of it surpassed my expectations, I would say that, and I would definitely recommend the movie to other people.
Great.
I think for other people that might, look at a movie like what I was kind of mentioning before and feel that kind of, standoffishness to it, I think that they would kind of feel the same way about this movie.
Yeah, that's what I hope. So that's what I was hoping when I recommended it to you. Like I said, it's a movie where if you judge it by its cover, you're going to see this buddy comedy. It's a robot. Okay, so this is Short Circuit. An indie version of Short Circuit or something like that. And I think it does enough to avoid the cliches, have the humanity, and as I kind of express a lot, I like rooting for characters. I like seeing characters grow and develop and change, and I feel like this movie does enough where it has a bunch of rewatchability for me. I love it.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, Ray and I already have our flight booked to Honolulu, but before we make our way to the airport, Ray, what have you been watching?
I'm kind of in the middle of a lot of stuff, Rob, but one thing that I did finish was the Prime movie Ricky Stenicki.
Ricky Stenicki?
Starring Zac Efron and John Cena.
It's a Fairly Brother movie, right? Just one, isn't it?
Just one.
Just one, yeah. Just okay, one. That's what I thought.
So it was okay. It was like it had its funny parts. I was chuckling out loud a couple times.
Sure.
I thought John Cena was really good.
Yeah.
I really liked it. I love the concept of the movie, but I didn't love like the way it played out. But I found the concept to be hilarious. Like it really should have worked.
I did watch the trailer for that, so I was on the fence about watching it. So now that you've said that, I think I will definitely check it out. Now that you've said that,
yeah,
but I like Cena.
Yeah, I do too. And he's kind of continuing off that Peacemaker, vibe where he's just being really silly and funny. And I don't know, he does a really good job. So, Zac Efron's kind of more of a straight man. He's fine in it too, but the other two guys I really never got behind. Like I really kind of felt like maybe miscast. I don't know. They were okay. They just never like really hit for me.
It's hard in an ensemble comedy like that. You know, if you think of
Yeah.
really great ones like 40-Year-Old Virgin or Anchorman, like
All those guys got to lift their weight though.
yeah, absolutely, and that's hard. So if you're in a group comedy and like half the cast is funny and half the cast is kind of meh, yeah, I can see it definitely losing some
Yeah, but
momentum.
I love the concept. Should have worked, but and it did in parts. But what about you? What you been checking out?
Well, I've watched two movies. Andrea and I watched Lisa Frankenstein,
I'm
which
not sure I've really seen much about that.
it is uh, Robin Williams' daughter's directorial debut, but it was written by Diablo Cody. You know,
Okay.
Juno, wow, my mind's going blank. Tully,
Hmm.
everybody, know Diablo Cody. And I will say I'm not a huge Diablo Cody fan. I did enjoy Juno when it came out.
Yeah,
I actually
me
kind
too.
of like Jennifer's Body. I know that was kind of like maybe a bit of a divisive one. I don't know, but I did enjoy Jennifer's Body to a degree. But I will say I really did not like
This wasn't
Lisa
it for you.
Frankenstein. Yeah, though it was very weird. The funniest thing is I think they were kind of going for a bit of a John Waters thing. Some of the comedy was like so over the top and
Uh-huh.
kind of out there that you're just like, I don't know. Like
Yeah.
I don't feel like it's really jiving for me. The concept was interesting, but yeah, I thought as far as like a Diablo Cody written screenplay, I felt like it even for her, I was kind of like, I don't know. But uh, another funny aspect of it was, I looked up the Rotten Tomato score, and it's one where like the critic score is low, and the audience score is really high.
Hmm.
And
I usually like those kind of movies.
yeah, you never can tell like what that's gonna bring, because a lot of times you're like, oh, well, that actually could mean that I would really enjoy it. But yeah,
You
no,
agree with the critics this time.
I will say I agree with the critics this time.
You're
But
gone corporate on us.
but the second movie I want to talk about is also in the same boat, low critic score, high audience score, and we went to the theater this weekend as a family to see Godzilla X Kong,
Yeah.
the new
So what does
Empire.
the X mean?
I
Like
had no idea.
Times Kong?
I guess,
Like,
yeah, it is a bit of an odd title
Yeah.
choice, because they're not really against each other like the last
Yeah.
iteration, but on this one, I will say I was with the audience, the high audience score, because it was actually pretty fun. It was a little bit tighter of a movie than I feel like the last couple have been. It was less than 2 hours.
Yeah.
So and for a kaiju movie, it felt kind of compartmentalized, where it was a bit smaller scale, not necessarily in like uh, the world itself.
Right.
Obviously it's big in
It's
that
Hollow
regard,
Earth.
and,
It's
right,
huge scale.
exactly, and the kaiju battles and all of that, and it still takes place, in certain aspects, in different parts of the world, but the story feels pretty small, and
Yeah.
it's like kind of like building to this like one very distinct moment, and then that's kind of it. But I think all the characters are great that they brought back from the previous movies and stuff, and I think the kaiju action was great. My son was super into it
I was gonna
because
say I really care more about what your son thought about
we
it
should
than
have
what
had
you
him
do.
here.
Because he's kind of fallen off Legendary a little bit.
He has. He's not as big of a fan of Legendary as he used to be, but he is a big kaiju fan, but he's not as big onto Legendary as he used to be. But this kind of brought him back a little bit because they had some of the more obscure kaiju in there that I think he really enjoyed seeing on
Very
screen.
cool. Well, Rob, this is it. This is the end of our Brian and Charles episode.
Brian.
Is no longer being talked about because the episode's over. Since it's over, we'd like everybody who listens to this podcast to please take the opportunity to like the podcast, comment on the podcast, tell us what you liked about the movie, leave us a 5-star review. We will probably someday read it on air.
We would really be able to like to be able to do that at some point.
That would be
but,
cool.
They say that at the end of a lot of podcasts, and I just don't know how often it happens. But we're gonna try it at some point down the road. But if there is a comment section, Now, that we
There-
would love
there
you to
should
take
be.
advantage. And hopefully, if there is, on whatever platform you're on, if there is a comment section, leave a comment of a movie that Ray and I should watch, because we're rapidly running out of them in this content-saturated world. So
That's true.
please send us your recommendations. We'd love to try to find a new movie that we have not seen that we can love. And you know what? Maybe somebody else in our audience will also see that post and also watch that movie and maybe even love it.
That's the goal.
But we will be back in 2 weeks.
Yes,
And
we
it's
will.
back to me, right?
It's going to be your week.
Is it back to me? Okay, well, I better come up with something good, because I got nothing right
Yeah, I need something good to watch.
now. Well,
Something better than Ricky Stenicki.
well, if that's the
Challenge
bar,
set.
that gauntlet is thrown. So tune in next week, or 2 weeks, I should say, and see if I can recommend
Next episode.
something better to Ray than Ricky Stenicki. You're not going to want to miss it. So until then, this is Car Ray Rob.
Where I'm Ray.
And I'm Rob. And remember, be defined by the films you love, not the ones you hate.
Hey there, it'll be just a little while till Ray and Rob spit their spittle. Come on, check out of the hospital. So grab some of your best peanut brittle. This will be a darn good transmittal. And say hello to my little film.
Hey everyone, Rob here. I was just kidding. I know exactly what I'm doing next week. It blew my mind to recently find out that Ray had never seen Gattaca. Can you believe that? Gattaca. Great movie. That is what I'm going to be recommending next week. So if you get a chance, check it out before the episode, so be ready to rock and roll when we are.